Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your co-MC Rich.
And I'm your co-MC Rach, or should I say co-GM, because...
dipping right into the GM-MC controversy right away. Yes, I went and double-checked. Blades in the Dark does call it a GM. Which brings us to our topic, Forged in the Dark, our summer series. What have we learned?
Yes, it's our post-mortem episode where we talk about our experiences, both through interviews and exploring Forged in the Dark at our own pace, much like the Belonging Outside Belonging recap episode from last year.
Very much like it. In fact, you might recognize some of the structure of this episode because I looked at that show outline and said, that looks smart. Let's do that again.
I don't know. This year's been 2 decades, so...
Forged in the Dark, our summer series, we had 7 different games, 7 different game designers on, actually 8, because we had 2 for one particular episode, Scum and Villainy. During the summer, I did my very best to take a deep dive into Forged in the Dark games. I played Mothlight, which was run amazingly by Agatha for the Gauntlet, as well as Stars in the Dark, a Blades in the Dark reskin by my buddy Undish that he created. It's a true reskin. It's basically Blades, but in Star Wars. It's awesome. I ran Songs for the Dusk and Cyberpunk, which is CBR plus P and K. That was for the Gauntlet. And I also ran Scum and Villainy for the Plus One Forward home game. Luckily, I got to play in a couple of playtests for a game called Score. I say it excitedly because it has 2 exclamation points, which is a game you can get on itch from Geo. And it is a really cool anime-styled sports drama. Forged in the Dark game is pretty cool. So in total this summer, I ran or played 19 different Forged in the Dark game sessions.
That's so many for such a short period of time.
It was a lot, but it was well worth it. Now, unlike last summer's Belonging Outside Belonging, where I very frequently proclaimed I was a baby gamer in the Bob world, I wasn't quite a babe in the woods with Forged in the Dark games before starting the summer series. I'd played, and I do track my plays on RPG Geek. I recommend you do it too if you're as, numbers loving as me. And if you're not, don't worry about it. But I played dozens of sessions of Blades in the Dark and Scum and Villainy, but I had never GM'd it. And I found that by focusing so hard in this summer, and also having to GM it, I was able to grasp it much more fully, to get over my previous trepidations about Forged in the Dark, about how mechanical the game was, and how it felt to me at first blush. It was also really fun to see some games that were developed after Blades in the Dark had been out there for a few years and adopted by a thriving community. That's the CBR plus P and K, or the Cyberpunk game, and Mothlight is Songs for the Dust. I would consider all those like Gen 2-ish Forged in the Dark style games, and so that was a nice experience.
I think we flipped positions this summer in comparison to last summer. Before we started the summer series last year, I had a lot of experience with Belonging Outside Belonging, both by playing the original Dream Askew, playing lots of hacks, playtesting a lot of hacks because Bob was really popular for making hacks a couple of years ago, so I played a lot of half-finished games. Forged in the Dark, on the other hand, before the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of traction in my local, wider gaming community. I remember struggling to fill tables of Scum and Villainy at gaming conventions. And this is Scum and Villainy. That's an easy sell. It's Star Wars, right? It's Star Wars.
Right.
But it did not capture people's imaginations. And my attempts at playing various Forge games, they didn't go so hot. We would get a first session and it would be very cold and mechanical, and we'd all stare at the mechanics and have a conversation about how it wasn't PbtA, and then nothing more would come of it.
Yeah. And coming into the summer series, I often experienced, and I asked John about this, John Harper, in the very first episode, the downtime as a board game. I saw that. I saw that as a thing that happened. oh, I got a whole lot of mechanical bits that I need to take care of. Let's go ahead and knock those out really quickly. And over the summer series, I've fought that pretty hard, and I'm super happy that we did so in the Plus One Forward home game, because I feel like it really enriched the roleplay and the understanding of the characters as characters outside of doing jobs, doing heists, that kind of thing. So I do think, as John said, you totally should explore that downtime. And I was really happy about that. But that was definitely a trepidation I had coming in.
I think going through the notes of this episode, this is going to be a theme over and over again, is the interplay of mechanics and role-playing as something we've experienced and explored both separately and together.
Mm-hmm. All right, Rach, what aspect of Forged in the Dark has captured your imagination the most?
There's one specific kind of quirky mechanic that's really grabbed my imagination, and in the Stars and Wishes sections of the home game, I keep bringing it up, and that is flashback actions.
Mm-hmm.
As we've talked about through interviews in the summer series, some Forged in the Dark games have a flashback mechanic. To explain this quickly, in case any listeners are joining us for the first time, this mechanic, or this type of mechanic, allows a player to spend a in-game currency like stress or coin or reputation, declare an action that their character did at some point in the past, and maybe make a roll on that if the GM deems a roll necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I think often players are thinking about RPG events in a linear fashion. I know Forge games aren't the only games to have flashback mechanics, but they aren't super common. Think about the moves in Apocalypse World, for example. We talk about, in the context of playing Apocalypse World, to do it, but that's a mindset that's very much in the present tense.
Mm-hmm.
My character sees the thing they want and then rolls seize by force. We don't ask questions like, what if my character already knew they want the thing and surprised the actual thing? I seize that a whole day before and it's stored safely back at base.
Mm-hmm.
We don't play around with concepts like that. But it is a type of storytelling we do see in heist fiction,
Mm-hmm.
which Blades is explicitly based off of. It pops up in other types of fiction as well.
It does. It hops in that media fiction, and it takes a certain degree of mindset adjustment to be able to have that permission. And I know not all of Forged in the Dark games do this, but I love that it's a cost. So I've got this cool thing. GM makes a quick adjudication of X or Y stress. There are some guidelines usually, so it doesn't feel unfair. Then we jump right into the fiction. You've got the thing, and it adjusts the situation accordingly. It's very fast, and I love what it gives you, which is the ability to jump in feet first to do stuff rather than spending hours figuring out how to have all the stuff set up.
What elevates it, rather than just having a loose conversation at the table, is the idea that there are mechanics. There is I want to do this, here are the rules to do that thing, rather than the GM going, well, I guess you could make this type of action check and that will justify what happened, and we'll just sort of gloss over. It's like, no, I want to do this thing, GM. Let me do the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also gives players tools for playing a character that is smarter potentially than you. I mean, I have seen enough panels and enough podcast episodes playing around with that question of how do you play a character that is smarter than you? And there's not always mechanics to support that style of play. When you come to the realization of what is happening in the fiction, almost as if you were the audience member, you can lean into the idea of, but my character would be smarter, therefore I know my character did this thing off screen ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is me showing off that my character is cool and doing the really neat thing right now. Speaking for my own play style, I don't like games where there's a major metagame component of crafting characters into this honed engine that will never fail. I like it when my characters fail or when they have mixed outcomes, because I like playing around with the aftermath. And I think that flashbacks do provide an additional tool for, okay, this thing I assumed was going to happen didn't happen, but what can spin off of that next rather than just a straight failure?
This is a tangentially related, but I feel pretty important. Blades in the Dark, and I've also seen it Scum and Villainy and a number of the other Forged variants, they give you an XP for rolling a desperate action. And so there is a mechanical reward, a cookie, for doing the crazy thing. And if you craft your flashback to give you improved effect, then you can still be rolling that desperate action. But if you pull it off, then it's a huge payoff and you get the cookie. And I think that's really, really cool.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into that also a little bit later in this episode about how Forged in the Dark makes more space for player characters to maybe act a little bit more reckless, and for perhaps even the GM acting a little bit more reckless.
Yeah, definitely.
Rich, what aspect of Forged in the Dark captured your imagination?
Scale. I knew this coming in, but during the summer series, having these conversations, playing a little bit more deeply, I found a lot of joy in the idea of playing a character and collaborating with all the other characters and players to grow and shape the crew or the group or the ship in Scum and Villainy parlance, and to see the interplay of the factions, like that whole next scale up story that's taking place, some of the little petty squabbles between Horst Kessel and Abrikian Industries that happened in our Scum and Villainy game. Like, I just really enjoyed that emergent storytelling that happened as a result of the jobs or heists that everyone is performing. This sense of scale is something that I'm always eager to try in RPGs, from Birthright to Impulse Drive, which has the ship sheet.
Mm-hmm.
But Forged in the Dark has so many tools for this type of play. It really is the primary focus, just like John Harper talked about when we launched this. I'm 5 sessions into a Blades in the Dark game, the Stars in the Dark game I mentioned before. It's been super fun. We're just now starting to talk about turf and claims, which is a whole set of boxes that you can see on the Blades in the Dark crew sheets. And I'm like, I've never engaged with that. I played dozens of sessions and just never got there because the scale works on a lot of different levels. It's cool. It's kind of a fractal deal.
I was reflecting on your examples of emergent storytelling. The one I keep coming back to from the home game is we have a job board. It's a listing of various jobs, and if jobs sit on the job board too long, Rich as the GM will say, this one's gone because this faction took it. And this faction took this job specifically to spite your faction.
Yeah.
Which I still haven't gotten petty revenge on, but, I'm planning it.
Someday you guys will go head up to war with the Razor Girls, and it's going to be ugly and beautiful at the same time. So I'm looking forward to our crew rising up tiers, taking on new turf, getting new assets, all these options that I have not experienced in an RPG in a long time. It's just not a place where a lot of the story games that I've been playing in sit. It's not a focus. And Forged in the Dark definitely has that focus. And it's exciting. All right, flip mode, Rach. What aspect of Forged in the Dark did you find underwhelming this summer?
Well, if I were to say one aspect that I found underwhelming, this heist game focuses an awful lot on jobs /scores /etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that on its own isn't too bad, but it does put players, I find, into a very specific mindset where they want to start thinking about every single minute detail. This is less of a feature of Forged in the Dark overall, and I think more of a bug that exists in just heist storytelling.
Yeah. And it stinks because there are tools built within the Forge in the Dark, like especially in Blades, to try to get around that?
Sort of.
Okay.
So I thought about that. I decided to sit there and go like, I have at points been like, this game is slowed down. I'm going to shove the tool out into the middle of the table and see how people react. So there are some tools that help the game moving. They don't get rid of the problem completely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just a side effect of there are players who really love these nitty-gritty details and they love overthinking things. To highlight some of these tools that if you, listener, are struggling with this at your table, Flashbacks, as I was saying in the aspects we enjoyed, is a big one because it is ideally a tool to stop you from over-preparing from a score because you can't over-prepare for things that you don't know are going to happen, but you can't talk about retroactive preparing when things eventually happen. Play to find out what happens, I guess. Loadout is a really interesting one. So loadout is you decide what the aesthetic of your character is before you start a job or a score. Do you want to look like you're just an average citizen? Do you want to look like you're some kind of rogue up to trouble? Do you want to look like you're kitted out for a war? You decide that, and it's kind of becomes your encumbrance, but you don't have to decide every single tiny detail and every single piece of equipment you have on you because your loadout is your encumbrance, and then as the story goes on, you're like, oh yeah, of course I have 40 feet of rope. Of course I have this. And then you click them off to the limit of your loadout. So it's not infinite, but it gives you a lot of flexibility and you don't have to be married to, as soon as I leave our ship, my Stitch has a medical uniform and X amount of medical supplies. It could be like, no, I have candy right now in this moment where it becomes very useful to bribe a child. Types of plans, they're kind of a softer mechanic. When you start a score, for example, you have a list of types of plans, which are frameworks in which to think about the action. In theory, once the table decides on what type of plan they want to run, the GM can cut immediately to that. But sometimes I found we sort of sat and spun on, well, what type of plan is this truly? Is it infiltration or is it social?
Yeah, I think there were a few opportunities for us as a group where I feel like the table was a little too clever by half and wanted to come at everything sideways. And I don't know if that was a Forge in the Dark problem or if the problem existed in that I really blame me. You blame yourself, then you can fix yourself much more easily than anyone else. And I just reached a point where I probably could have nudged folks a little harder. Like, hey, let's get to an engagement roll. Because there were times when we stalled out. It was definitely a point where I thought this game was supposed to not have this happen.
It's such a tricky thing to read, though, from the GM perspective, because you have to ask yourself, are my players having a good time taking a magnifying glass and looking at everything? Is that the joy they're getting out of the table? And in the case of a specific example, we didn't know it was a frustration until someone brought it up in Stars and Wishes afterwards.
That's true.
But it seemed like everyone who was communicating and plotting out the plan seemed to be having a good time. And then in the aftermath, we found out they weren't. I think that's very hard to sort out. I don't know if there is a good solution to that other than, we know this is a problem. Maybe we could check ourselves in the future. And that falls back, I think, more to soft skills that you can't really provide mechanics for.
Yeah.
All right, time to air out our dirty laundry, Rich. What part of Forge in the Dark did you find underwhelming?
The swap meat problem. I'm just making up a term. Everything is up for discussion. Every single thing. You can flashback to solve problems. There are multiple devil's bargains that can be offered and rejected. A GM could declare a hard move and a player resists it, so it never happened. There are many ways to slice this onion, and it, for me, can get overwhelming to figure out, okay, wait, what actually happened? Because my brain will run through each of the permutations, and being able to let go of those, but that isn't real, is hard. It's been a real challenge for me. forward progress often feels slower in a game that is built to just speed through some things. Like you do that engagement roll, and it's supposed to jump you like 65% way through your plan. That's amazing. But I still found that there's a whole lot of stop-start, a whole lot.
And I have seen some of those mechanics you mentioned move pretty fluidly depending on the situation. And there are times where they just kind of stall everything out, where it's like, all right, players are going to decide how they want the situation to go. And then we're going to theory craft what we need to do to get it to go there. Or the social version of there is one locked door and every player is going to make their own attempt to try to unlock it, and you GM are going to have to entertain every single roll that's being made.
Oh, it's not a killer. It isn't. I just want to make sure that that's clear. But it's one of those things that has definitely been a low point for me, of just holding in my mind and letting go all of the possibilities that didn't really happen, and having that this is the events that have occurred. Like, my notes are trash. I have to rewatch significant portions of previous sessions to keep it straight.
Yeah, I have found that I've had to go back and make a few more references to notes, because sometimes my mind holds on to things that we discussed that didn't actually factor into the story. Like, okay, I don't have this NPC's name down here. Maybe they weren't actually that important.
Okay, Rach, this is your first Forged in the Dark game. What might make the process easier for you?
All right, I got 2 excellent pieces of beginner advice for players. I'm going to go mostly player-centric on my end. They build off of each other. First off, and you've heard this before if you've listened to the podcast and previous episodes, pick the obvious ability on your character sheet. They've talked about this before with Powered by the Apocalypse characters too. There is, in many Forged in the Dark games, something that we would call the obvious ability at the top of your playbook. When you're building your first character, they tell you to take an ability. You should go take that ability and test it out when the game lets you. Play around with this. I'm thinking of, again, the home game. I'm playing a Stitch, which is the healer/doctor playbook. The Stitch's special abilities can get really quirky and fiddly and kind of meta-fiction-y in terms of what they let you do. But the starting ability is called I'm a Doctor, Not a ... which allows a player to roll their doctor rating while performing actions that normally wouldn't use doctor for the role, as long as you can go back and describe how that relates to your character's medical experience. Normally, that's a really quick stat swap ability. Seems pretty basic. But now, early in the game, every single time you want to switch your role and make it a doctor role, it's now story time. And in a game that is going to be very mechanical focused for your first session, it's intentionally making space to think about role-playing and thinking about being in character and building out like a little bit of that lore between you and the rest of the table. Storytelling in your story game.
Yay!
And that leads to my next piece of advice, which is, if this is your first Forged in the Dark game, it's absolutely okay for your first session to be focused on mechanics. There are a lot of mechanics that are going to be new to you. There's some that might read a little bit familiar if you have lots of PbtA experience, but it's like learning to ride a bike would be the best example I can give. Is you got to figure out how to keep that bike stable and going forward before you decide, okay, I want to take it down this trail to go see this other thing. Forge games can feel very mechanics forward, especially if you're coming directly from Powered by the Apocalypse. We aren't looking at moves with prompts when you make X action, perform Y check. You're looking at mechanics and asking questions like, what position is my character in? What is the effect of my role? Which is going to intentionally rip your perspective away from the fiction and have you start thinking about dice and outcomes. Again, this is why I lean into the idea of play around with the obvious mechanics first to figure out how they're supposed to work and then subvert the game after. Getting a feeling for that rhythm is central to figuring out where role-playing exists in Forged in the Dark. To go back to the scum and villainy example, you need to know how jobs work before you start talking about your jobs in character and try convincing the other characters at the table that we want to take job A as opposed to job B because of this fictional reason. But to get there to the point where job selection becomes in character, we got to figure out how the jobs work.
Well, here's one piece of advice that I'd like to give past me when I first played Forged in the Dark. Players might get up in your business.
What?
Forged in the Dark has lots of mechanics, and there is a culture of kibitzing among Forged in the Dark players. And so other players are probably going to look at your sheet or make suggestions on how to model this particular project clock or give you tips on how you should do your downtime or best approaches to solve a problem. You should flashback with so-and-so. And there's that table talk, that swap meet thing. If you're the kind of person like me who might be a touchy little baby if you're struggling with a system and somebody just looks over your shoulder who isn't the GM and tells you how to do it better than you thought of doing it, just be advised that it's a crew. It's not competition, and you are still learning. And so it's okay to not know where all the bits are on the sheet. And if somebody says, oh, you can do it this way, listen to it charitably. Take that advice. You don't have to do what they say, but it might be a smarter way to go about it. It might be a more expedited way, or it might show you something that you're like, I'm not going to do that this time, but now I know that exists. I got really tweaked after my first few blades when somebody was all up in my business, and that's on me. And so I'm giving past me this advice. It's okay. No one is critiquing you, the player, by helping to show the depth of the mechanics, which I don't feel are all on that sheet you're looking at. There's a lot of dense information on that blade sheet, but there's also a lot of stuff behind it in the book.
You bring up an excellent point of thinking about your fellow players as being members of the same team, as being members of the same crew, because that is one of the key components to Forged in the Dark, is you all have that same end goal. I don't think that's very common with Powered by the Apocalypse games.
I mean, it's not. That's a big
there is
call.
A lot of break off and do your own thing, right?
There is, and there's also, help and interfere. You can help or you can interfere with somebody's move in all the PbtA, just about a lot of it. You can mess with somebody, you can give them a negative. Monster Hearts exists to have PvP. And then all of a sudden you jump into a Blades game and you're pretty much all on the same team. It's got that D&D mindset of but this is my crew.
I mean, you're a little bit more scoundrel-y, but it is hard, especially playing a lot of Monster Hearts is a great example because it's almost day and night of these people are probably not going to turn into monsters and try to kill me. Maybe. They might turn into monsters depending on what Forge game we're playing, but we're not at odds with each other, and the GM isn't going to try to make us pull guns on each other. We are going to do the score and hopefully all walk away victors because we all benefit from having the good outcome. It's a good way to check yourself.
Yeah. Another bit of advice, you are going to fail often if you don't, I'm stealing this term from Sherry and Lowell, grub for dice. If you've ever played a Tales from Loop or a Free League game where you're rolling lots of sixes and you're just looking for a 6. You're just looking for a 6. You'll find that that's supposed to be a 12% chance. It doesn't work out that way. It just never feels like it works out that way. If you start off with 2 dice, you're going to fail. Improve your position. Take devil's bargains. Get help from the other player characters. Use that stress. Get as many dice as you can. Acquire assets in your downtime. Flashback to improve the positions. Do all the things. Because it can easily become a fail spiral. And so game this system beg for dice. There's so much kibitzing going on that you can spend an extra 30 seconds or so just fiddling around to try to make sure you've built the best possible roll. Because once the dice hit the table, if you fail, then you're going to have to resist that, and that can get pretty expensive. So you might as well grub for those dice.
I mean, you can always resist it and then get all the stress and blow it up really fun in downtime when you overcompensate and then your character runs away again. Which has not happened to me yet, but I'm pretty sure that's happened to everyone else at our Scumability table at this point.
It's you and Mungo. You and Chris's characters are the only two OGs. Everybody else is like, I'll take this lost one and play a brand new PC. The last bit, and this is the warning to anybody that wants to GM or MC, GM a Forged in the Dark game, be ready to get tired. This game requires very minimal prep. Mostly faction level stuff, getting a few jobs ready. That's my experience with the prep that I do coming into a Forged in the Dark game. But the act of running it is much more intense than a PbtA game. You've got to make a lot of calls. In PbtA, someone says, I've triggered this move. Yeah, I do this and this and this. And as an MC, you listen and you move on a fail, or you hit the hard reaction after their choices and you move forward. In Forged in the Dark, especially Blades, someone says, I want to do a thing. Now they're defining their action. Now they're going to ask you, what is the position? What is the effect? Then they're going to ask for a devil's bargain. Every single time they do a thing, those three things are going to happen. And those are all micro decisions you've got to make. And I'm not complaining. I'm just warning you. At the end of every session, I felt a little tired. It felt like a series of sprints. So be prepared to be a little tired. Now, I will offer a helpful hint. Don't be afraid to ask the table for ideas and devil's bargains. Don't do it all the time. But if you really are tapped out, just say, you know what? Does anyone have any cool ideas for a devil's bargain? And then they're going to come up with much worse devil's bargains than you ever would. And then they're all going to get tickled, and it gives you a little respite. And then, as we have heard in a previous interview, tilt it a little bit maybe, twist the knife just a wee bit or whatever, change it slightly if you want. And don't be afraid to default to risky position standard effect. Those are the defaults. It's okay to use it. Take care, GM. You're going to do a little more work than a PbtA game if you're running a Blades or a Forged in the Dark game.
The thing you didn't mention that I also think is important to bring up is I know in PbtA circles, we joke a lot about NPC bloat, specifically with games like Urban Shadows. Rich's NPC sheets look like Urban Shadows sheets in terms of who is working for what faction, who is allied with who. Like, there's a lot to keep track of in the background that isn't immediately coming up with situations.
That's true. It does mean I get to go through all my Pinterest boards, and that's a good thing. But it's a lot. And it's a lot for player staff to track too. But yeah, your GM, every time I see a faction, I want to put a face to that faction. I want someone who represents allow their personality to color what that faction's about, what their goals, what their drives.
Let's take a moment to consider the relationship between Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark. We know historically many people present these two as being connected, with Apocalypse World inspiring Blades in the Dark. But what is the appeal for PbtA fans? Is the connection like Belonging Outside Belonging, or is it slightly different?
Oh, it is so drastically different.
The looser structure of Bob, and we're going to call it Bob because it's fun to say, makes the connection to Powered by the Apocalypse much easier to see. There are still moves in Bob. They are short descriptions of what your character could do. You're moving tokens around instead of rolling dice, and that's Bob. That's pretty much all of Bob, right? I'm not hating on Bob, but it's very clear when you have the hard moves, soft moves, or however you wish to label them. The ones that cost a token, the moves that you can always do, and the moves that will gain you a token. Mm-hmm. It's very clear, especially if it's derivative of a Powered by the Apocalypse game where it's inspired from. You're like, oh, I get this, sort of. With Forged in the Dark, we're thinking about mechanics and game structure so differently. Mm-hmm. You aren't triggering moves, you're making engagement rolls. When you're making actions, those rolls, they feel like skill checks rather than triggering a piece of fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Special abilities, some of them are very move-like.
You could definitely see the DNA there, yeah.
You could definitely see move DNA in special abilities, but when it comes to those actions, or whatever the Forged in the Dark game calls it, it's very much more like a conventional RPG that you could pull somebody out of a big con and they'd be like, oh yeah, I recognize this. I want to do this thing. I roll those dice. Boom.
Every single roll is an act under fire roll.
Kind of. What would you say in reflection from this summer series would be your highs from Forged in the Dark summer series?
I got a wildest of wild takes for my highs. Forged in the Dark gave me Marvel heroic role-playing feels.
What? That is wild. Okay, keep going.
More so than like games that you would expect, like Cortex or Sentinels, to be more Marvel heroic. It's a really weird way to think about it, but I think where that feeling comes from is Forged in the Dark sits at this interesting crossroads of, here are interesting mechanics you can hang role-playing off of, and here's some really interesting fiction we have space to put a game into. That synergy of, you're either thinking of the fiction and then you have mechanics in the background, but then you can think about the mechanics and the fiction happily sits in the background. A big part of this is just how present setting is in Forged in the Dark games. It's very challenging to escape the pre-built setting.
Mm-hmm.
Scum and Villainy is a serial numbers filed off, to use that expression, version of Star Wars. It is not marketed as Star Wars. It cannot call itself Star Wars. It's kind of Star Wars. It's hard to see it as anything but that for me. And I think this very strong setting, that's a feature of a lot of John Harper's games. And I think it's informed a lot of the Forge games that have come after. And I think there's a special type of fun that comes from storytelling with a limited set of tools to play with.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of story games will go looser. So you have just sort of infinite toys of which you want to pick what excites you right now. And then everyone brings stuff from their infinite toolbox and we try to make them all talk to each other, as opposed to, this is a city, there is a map, the police department is over here at this part of the community and your headquarters is over there, and maybe they might move, but these are the starting positions and here's the NPCs and which one do you want to talk to, because they're all listed.
So true. So many characters. For me, a high was a shocker, and I would not have listed this as a high until it happened to us this week. Downtime mechanics coming into this summer series. I always complained that like downtime mechanics were just board gamey and there's no role playing going on. And then in the home game, when a player had a rough day at work, and we play after work, and we have a standing thing of real life trumps game. And we had a situation that would have, for any other game, been a canceled game session for us. And we're bi-weekly, so that's like a month that you miss, and my heart was breaking. But that player, even though they had a terrible, crappy work day, were cool with showing up on the Zoom call, working through XP from last session because we ran a little long because I'm bad at time management in this game for some reason. And we talked through downtime actions. And for the person who was like, I'm really brain fried, I just need to hang out with some friends, they could do all the downtime stuff because it was board gamey. But for the folks who had the energy and the chutzpah and wanted to tease out things into scenes, we had that, what I consider more fully featured downtime activity. And we had a couple of chatty scenes and we worked through a few things and learned some backgrounds and still finished all the downtime and XP and did the expenditures for all of the stuff, got things fixed and did all kinds of game stuff. But the different levels of engagement required enabled us to have a game session where one wouldn't have occurred with any other game. And it lit my mind on fire in a happy way when that happened.
It was really funny because I think early in the summer series, the idea of a whole session that is just downtime, I came up a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
And then that happened, but it happened completely by accident. 100% not intended,
Mm-hmm.
because it was a triage situation of like, well, we want to get together and socialize. We have this unfinished business from the game. Let's just talk about it. Again, going to how the game mechanics and the storytelling components are so intertwined, just doing the downtime actions isn't separate from the fiction. Like, you have to talk about the story. You have to talk about your character. You don't have to spend a lot of time going in depth, but you're still talking about the story.
It was super cool. I have a brand new, fresh respect for the capabilities of downtime in that you can engage with it. Sorry to use a slightly Game of Fortune in the Dark term, but you can set the level of mental effort in there, and it can totally be just like, I'm going to click off my things. I'm going to do the playbook advancement. I'm going to move on. I'm done. That's good. I've got other thing to take care of. And then other people can engage a little bit more RP, a little more story. And it's all legitimate. It's all valid. That's cool. That's really, really cool.
On the flip side, how about lows? It's not quite like the most underwhelming aspects, but what brought you down during the summer series?
I'm not going to say that's a hipster thing to say. I'm working on my Forged in the Dark game and it's at 0.5. But man, if you're looking for a finished Forged in the Dark game, a published, done thing, there are not that many of them. A bunch are absolutely playable, but in development. And it's weird. It's like the dev cycle for this style of game, the system makes it so complicated. Maybe the level of world building with factions, all those bits. That dev cycle's really long. Man, Blades is not a new game. And there are a handful of published, done. We're not touching it. It's almost like making a Forged in the Dark game is the same way as kibitzing at the table while playing a Blaze in the Dark game. And I was shocked at how few that are done. And I worry about that dev cycle. Apologies for anyone that gets offended by this. Is this the Rick Grimes movie? Is this a thing that comes out after folks have moved on from The Walking Dead? I hope not, because I want the whole Forged in the Dark thing to have a longer tail. But some of these games got to be done. Perfect is the enemy of done sometimes. How long do you have to work on it? I don't know, says the guy who's been working on a baseball game for about 14 years.
I think you're correct in terms of like the depth of the mechanics and the depth of the world building in order to get those to work back and forth together, result in Forged in the Dark games being a bigger project than I think designers realize. Again, for some context, the games that we feature on Plus One Forward, unless we're doing a specific special episode dedicated to in-production games, have to be in a state where you, the listener, could go purchase it and play around with it right now. So either on Kickstarter or fully released.
Absolutely.
There are not a lot of Forged in the Dark games that are in that state.
Yep.
On a similar note, I don't want to say this because, again, I don't really want to offend people. I felt a lot of Forged in the Dark game mechanics felt kind of samey across different games. Again, I wonder if it's tied into Forged in the Dark being relatively younger, or a design ethos or a design school that doesn't have a lot of finished products out in the marketplace to reference things back and forth. To compare it with PbtA, we're at a point where designers have strapped new ideas onto Apocalypse World, torn apart old ones, and have really twisted the idea of what Powered by the Apocalypse could mean. We talk a lot about what designers fixate on different things. Are clocks important? Are clocks there at all? That's a classic example. And when we were talking to designers for the last year's summer series with Bob Games, we had designers from very different perspectives about what No Dice, No Masters, Belonging Outside Belonging meant to them. And in both Powered by the Apocalypse and Bob, those plots could be at odds with different designers. Again, don't take this the wrong way. This isn't to say those two places, Bob and PbtA, are creative spaces in conflict. What I mean is there's designers taking ideas in different directions that may not harmonize or agree with each other. And I got the impression from at least the designers we interviewed, we haven't quite hit that moment with Forged in the Dark games.
Yeah.
Now, as a consumer, that might be great because you'll have a good idea of what you're getting because there'll be touchstones that connect those games together. But from the perspective of someone who talks to a lot of designers and has read quite a few PbtA, Bob, and now Forged in the Dark games, I was hoping for someone to take Forged in the Dark and flip it upside down, twist something around. You were saying you were bumping into a couple of newer games towards the end of the summer series. They're hitting that point. I've heard rumbles of a game that is just all downtime.
Yeah.
But I don't know if those are on the wider stage yet.
Right. They're still in development, Rach.
Forever in development. This does make me want to go back and look at old Metatopia playtest listings and see what Forged in the Dark games were present, over the last few years and what have fallen out of development and what has actually gone through, and see if we can use that to build a timeline.
Curious. Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of our postmortem, our wrap-up on the summer series on Forged in the Dark. Rach, thanks so much for going on this journey with me through the Forged in the Dark landscape, the milieu of Forged in the Dark games.
Well, you've definitely changed my perspective on Forged in the Dark, and I've really enjoyed listening to different designers' thoughts, seeing the interesting places the game can go. I mean, again, I don't want to sound like we're poo-pooing. I came in from like a similar standpoint to you, Rich, where I was like, this feels very board gamey, to coming around and saying, oh no, I could definitely see where the role-playing lives here.
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed our home game and the other games that I've been able to experience, and I'm continuing on. Scum and Villainy will continue until we decide we want to play something else, and so shall Stars in the Dark forever.
Well, until we have a new summer series that we have to play things for.
Oh man, what are we going to do next summer? Well, we'll talk about that off air. Rach, thanks so much for hopping on here and chatting with me about this.
And thank you for joining me today too, Rich.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our PbtA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.